All right, excellent. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining, for making time today. Happy Thursday. So I'm pleased today to introduce Sohrab Salimi. So Sohrab is the founder and CEO of Agile Academy. He's been teaching Scrum for many, many years, as far as I'm aware. So some of us might even have seen his videos on Agile and Scrum on YouTube. And for those of us who may not be aware of his work, Saurabh is actually a trained medical doctor. So he's had quite a career and has helped organizational leaders from startups to Fortune 500 companies rethink how they build products, empower teams, and adapt to a rapidly changing world. He has previously served on the Scrum Alliance board of directors as well, right? Before the pandemic, I believe. Is that right, Saurabh?
Yes.
Yes. So he's based in Cologne, Germany, right, where he balances life as a father of three with his passions, sport, music, and the pursuit for lifelong learning. So thank you, Saurabh, for making time to join us today. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Victor, for the invitation. And good evening, everyone. When I was writing my talk, I started as usual with like, good morning. And I'm like, oh no, it's not morning. It's evening in Singapore. So thank you for being here, especially after a busy day at work. I want to start by acknowledging something that we all know but rarely say out loud. Most agile transformations are failing. Not because the principles are wrong, not because people aren't trying hard enough, but because we're trying to build, and that's something that I fundamentally believe, we're trying to build agility on top of bureaucratic foundation, and that's structurally impossible. The title of today's talk is When Bureaucracy Becomes the Impediment. So over the next 45 to 50 minutes, I'm going to make three key arguments. First, that bureaucracy wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. Alternatives existed even in the industrial era. But most organizations lacked the courage or the creativity to pursue them. Understanding this history helps us see why bureaucracy persists today, not because it works, but because it's familiar. Second, that the context which made bureaucracy tolerable has fundamentally changed. What was once a defensible choice is now actively harmful for most organizations. And third, eliminating bureaucracy requires changing mechanisms, not just good intentions. I'll show you what that looks like in practice, drawing on organizations like Haier in China and Bayer in Germany that are attempting this at massive scale, and how their approach align with philosophical wisdom from both Eastern and Western traditions. So my goal isn't to give you a blueprint to copy. I fundamentally believe there is no best, only better. This is one of the philosophies applied at Toyota. My goal is to help you diagnose the structural impediments in your own organizations and understand what kinds of mechanisms change might move towards something better. So, who am I? Victor already mentioned a few things. I believe it helps if I add a few more things to that. So, my name is Sohrab Salimi. You can see it also here on this shirt. I'm the founder and CEO of Agile Academy, but my journey to this work wasn't straightforward, and neither was my formation. I was born in Iran, came to Germany when I was 4 years old. My father is an engineer with a passion for philosophy who loved both traditions. He introduced me to Kant and Hegel, but also to Confucius, Rumi, and Hafez. Our dinner table conversations moved between worlds, from Eastern concepts of harmony to Western ideas about individual liberty, from Persian poets to German philosophers and idealists.
Mhm.
I never saw myself as purely German or purely Iranian. I saw myself as someone who could move between the philosophical traditions, who could see that wisdom isn't owned by one culture, but is part of our shared human intelligence and inheritance. Then I became a medical doctor in medicine. Then I became a medical doctor. Now, in medicine, you learn very quickly that diagnosis precedes treatment. You can have the best intentions and the most advanced treatments available. But if you misdiagnose, that's where it all starts, right? If you misdiagnose the problem, nothing will work. You'll be treating symptoms while the underlying disease progresses. That training shaped everything that came after. I moved into management consulting, worked for 3.5 years with Bain& Company, and then I became an entrepreneur. And across all those domains, healthcare, consulting, building my own companies, I kept encountering the same patterns. Organizations that knew what they needed to do but couldn't do it. You've probably been there. Smart people, clear objectives, adequate resources, and still paralysis. As a doctor, when you see the same symptoms repeatedly, you start wondering, what is the underlying pathology? The symptom was always some version of, we need to move faster, we need to get closer to customers, or we need to be more innovative. But the underlying disease across all of those things, and you've probably seen them too, was bureaucracy. The very structures we built to create order were now preventing adaptation. And here's what fascinated me. Bureaucracy isn't like a tumor you can simply cut out. For me, it's more like an autoimmune disease. The organization's defense mechanism that once protected it and now is attacking its ability to function. So for the past 2 decades, almost 2 decades, I've been studying organizations that have actually cured these conditions, not through superficial interventions, new methodologies, better communication, leadership training, we've all been there, but through fundamental structural change. And what I discovered is this: the answers aren't in one tradition. They're not purely Western or purely Eastern. The Enlightened Capitalists, by the way, a great book recommendation of the 19th century, in England were discovering through practice what Confucian philosophy had articulated through reflection. Zhang Rumin, many years CEO at Haier, draws on ancient Chinese wisdom to build something radically modern. Bill Anderson, on the other side, at Bayer, combines Hayek's economics with principles of human development. My work has been about synthesis, about showing that what looks like new management theory is often the recovery of old wisdom, about demonstrating that the best organizational thinking draws from our entire human inheritance, East and West, ancient and modern, philosophical and practical. So this is what I want to share with you today. Not some kind of Western framework imposed on Eastern culture, not Eastern wisdom that ignores Western contributions, but evidence that when we're willing to learn from all traditions, we find principles that transcend any single culture. Principles like scaling through people, not just process. Developing human potential, don't just extracting labor. Trust judgment over compliance, and create citizens, not just employees. These ideas appear in Confucian thought, they appeared in the Enlightened Capitalists, they appear in modern experiments at Haier and Bayer, the 2 case studies that I will use for today's talk. They're not new, they're not foreign, they're human wisdom, rediscovered again and again by people who had the courage to question what everyone else took for granted. So that's the lens I bring to this work, and that's what I want to explore with you today. Before we go any further, I want to do a quick experiment with all of you. It's not that many people that are here, but still enough. So I'd like to ask you to close your eyes for about 10 seconds. Trust me, you can close your eyes, nothing's going to happen unless you're driving. So if you're driving, you're commuting, please keep your eyes open. Still try to do the thinking process. So now think of the last significant decision you had to escalate to a manager or a committee for approval. Visualize that moment. Now keep your eyes closed, but raise your hand if the person you escalated that decision to actually knew more about the specific problem than you did. Okay, open your eyes. Look around. How many hands are up? I mean, as you don't have your videos on, I don't see those hands, but you could raise your virtual hand. My assumption is not many hands go up. So whenever I do this exercise in a larger group of people, in an on-site talk or whatever, very few hands go up. This is the cost of bureaucracy. We're moving information up to people who know less to make decisions for people who know more. My talk will be structured in 5 acts, followed by a closing. Let's dive in. So the first act, this is all about the choice we made and the road not taken. Basically understanding, where does bureaucracy come from? Let me take you back to understand where bureaucracy came from. I want to start with something important. Bureaucracy was never inevitable. It was a choice many organizations took or made. And we have evidence that alternative paths existed even in the era where bureaucracy first emerged. So in the early 20th century, organizations are now getting larger. From groups of 3 to 4 people on average, factories are now employing thousands of people. Coordination is becoming impossible through informal relationships. This is the era of Max Weber and Frederick Taylor, the architects of what many of you know as scientific management. They faced a genuine problem. How do you coordinate thousands of people doing complex, interdependent work? Their solution was bureaucracy. Standardized processes, so work is predictable. Clear hierarchies, so someone can resolve the conflicts. Specialized roles, so people develop expertise. And centralized decision-making, so resources are allocated rationally. Now, there's more to that, but those are like 4 key components of bureaucracy. And this became the dominant model. But here's what's often forgotten. It wasn't the only path. Even at that time, right, at the same time, Weber and Taylor were building bureaucratic theory, a handful of business leaders were proving you could scale differently. Robert Owen in Scotland, the Cadbury family in England, William Lever, who built ultimately what became Unilever, and in America you had James Cash Perney and Levi Strauss. Now, these weren't small businesses. These were large enterprises, thousands of employees, so very similar to the other organizations that became bureaucratic. And they were profitable, often more profitable than their bureaucratic competitors. But they organized differently. They treated workers as assets to develop, not resources to extract from. They invested in housing, education, healthcare for employees and their families. They gave workers voice in decisions, and they shared in profits. They proved you could scale through people, not just process. So why did bureaucracy win? Here's the tragic pattern that historian James O'Toole documents in his book, The Enlightened Capitalist. These companies thrived initially under the founders. And those founders had fundamental beliefs, everything that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, when those founders died or lost control, when creditors took over, or when successors inherited the business, those enlightened practices, the things that made those companies unique, were abandoned. I can see this happening more or less in real time at one of the clients that I'm working with. 100-plus-year-old organization with a deep culture defined by the initial founder, but once that founder died, over now the past 2 to 3 decades, the company is losing its culture. It's becoming more and more bureaucratic. So when we look at this, bureaucracy was the path less taken because the path was forgotten. Now let me show you why bureaucracy felt rational, even if alternatives existed. 2 Austrian economists, and this is also something that Victor teased when he was publishing or marketing for this session, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek understood something that both Weber and Frederick Winslow Taylor missed. Mises in the 1920s, articulated the economic calculation problem. His insight was, without market prices, without genuine feedback from customers making voluntary choices, rational economic calculation becomes impossible. You cannot know what to produce, how much to produce, or at what cost, because you have no signal of actual value. Mises was arguing back then against central planning he saw happening in socialist economies. But his insight applies equally to the internal operations of large organizations. When you shield internal units, for example, HR, from market feedback, when you allocate resources through political negotiation rather than market mechanisms, you lose the ability to calculate rationally. 25 years later, so in 1945, Hayek extended this with the knowledge problem. His argument, knowledge in any organization is concentrated at the top, right? But in reality, it is dispersed, distributed throughout the organization. The person on the factory floor knows things the executive doesn't. The person facing the customer knows things that the headquarter doesn't. The engineer working on the product knows things the product manager doesn't. So centralized planning tries to aggregate all these dispersed knowledge up the hierarchy. But by the time it reaches the top, right, three things have happened. Number one, the information is outdated. The world has moved on, right? Second, it's filtered. People tell their bosses what they want to hear, not what they need to hear necessarily. And third, it is stripped of context. The richness, the nuance that made the knowledge actionable, that gets lost in translation, right? Especially if there are multiple layers that this information has to go through. So the result in organizations optimized for internal control, not customer value, right? Organizations where the primary skill becomes managing upwards, not serving customers. Organizations where resources get locked into annual budgets, right? Negotiated through internal politics rather than allocated towards emerging opportunities. But here's what I want you to understand. This wasn't inevitable, right? We mentioned this earlier. The enlightened capitalists had already proven you could organize differently. Most leaders, then and now, right? The important is also now, lacked the courage or creativity to follow that path because bureaucracy was easier. It was the default. It felt like control. It feels like what many management consultants refer to, the best practice, right? And who doesn't want to do the best practice? Now, for decades, organizations could live being bureaucratic structures. Why? Because markets were stable. There was not the pace of change that we see today. Information was scarce. It was a competitive advantage. Not like today. Today, information is abundant and instant. Just think about how all of us can use AI to quickly get the information we need. Customer needs were predictable. Now they're changing at a radical pace. And competition was regional, plus market barriers to entry were really high. All of that has changed. So what worked in the period from, let's say, 1950 to the emergence of the internet at the beginning or the end of the previous century, the beginning of this century, none of those things allow organizations to thrive in today's hyper-competitive environment driven by high pace of change, or especially technological change. And when you add the geopolitical uncertainties that we're all facing right now, it gets even worse, right? So this is why I would always encourage my clients move away from best practices. At Toyota, they say there is no best, only better, which became the foundation of lean thinking, of continuous improvement. And the same thing I think is true when we think about bureaucracies. So, what we want to do now, we understand what the hidden cost is to the organization to some extent. There is another dimension I want to add. I want to add what bureaucracy does to human beings. When someone works in your organization, let's say 40 hours a week for 20 or 30 years of their life, you're not just extracting labor in exchange for a salary. You're fundamentally shaping who that person becomes. Think about what bureaucratic organizations teach people. Escalate decisions rather than make them. Optimize for internal politics rather than customer value. Protect your turf rather than collaborate. Hoard information rather than share it. And last but not least, hit your budget number rather than create value. So now think about where these people go when they leave work. It's not difficult. You're all commuting somewhere now, right? You're going home to your families, maybe to your children, right? Every single person working in an organization is part of a community, is a citizen within the society. So I believe organizations are not just running a business, they're shaping citizens. This isn't a new insight. In Chinese and Confucian philosophy, there's a concept called, and I hope I pronounce it right, Junzi or something like that, the noble person. The idea isn't that someone or some people are born noble and others aren't. The idea is that you can cultivate it, right? That through proper relationships, proper education, and being held to high standards, people can develop virtue. That happens or doesn't happen within organizations. Organizations have that same obligation, not as charity, not as corporate social responsibility theater, but as a foundational recognition that people you employ are citizens of society, and you are shaping them whether you intend it or not. So, bureaucracy has not only a cost to the organization itself, making that organization slower, it also has a cost because it's not developing the type of citizen that we probably need in our organizations. Now let's look at a few other things. First, how agility tried to deal with that, and also how it failed, and then move into how the two companies that I want to cover are actually dealing with that. So Agile, you're all familiar with it. 25 years ago, exactly 25 years ago, in 2001, 17 men gathered in Snowboard, Utah, and wrote the Agile Manifesto. It promised something compelling: faster feedback loops, empowered teams, customer centricity. All of those challenges that bureaucracy creates to some extent. Now, many of you in this room have been part, hopefully, or I assume, of Agile transformations. You've introduced Scrum, Kanban, maybe even SAFe. You've trained product owners and Scrum Masters. You've run workshops on user stories and acceptance criteria. But how many of those transformations actually delivered on the initial promise? Unfortunately, I have to say from my own work, I'm not going to say zero, but not that many. We've had organizations where individual product teams succeeded, significantly reducing product development time, in truck development from 5 years to 18 months, in PCR test development from 9 months to 42 days. Amazing. But if you look at the entire organization, the organization becoming as a whole much faster in responding to customer feedback, to market changes, etc., that did not happen at the scale that we envisioned, right? Very few examples are out there where this was succeeded, right? So when we look at this, we realize, right, we have teams that are fighting for customer collaboration, while the finance department fights for contract negotiation. For those teams, for those individuals, be it agile coaches, scrum masters, internal or external, it doesn't really matter. This is exhausting. You are trying to run a network inside a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is winning. So, what we can do, what is it that we can do? I think there's a fundamental quote that I always come back to, and it comes from Amazon, actually from Jeff Bezos himself, stating good intentions don't work, mechanisms do. In many of the organizations where we introduce agile ways of working, it starts out as a good intention. Sometimes we even get to introduce a few good mechanisms. But the lack of organizational discipline, not individual discipline, organizational discipline of following through on those mechanisms, of changing also the stuff that is holding us back from being more agile, that results in most of these agile transformations failing. So with this in mind, I want us to explore two organizations that did a fundamentally better job on this, right? And I honestly don't know even to what extent they were supported by outside support, right? In one of them, I know because I'm seeing it now firsthand, but most of the things were coming from the inside. So what do structural alternatives look like? We start with Haier. And Haier is a Chinese appliance manufacturer. 100,000+ employees today, 10, 15, 20 years ago, obviously a smaller company. You probably have some of their products in your home. Could be refrigerators, washing machines, air conditioners. So they do all sorts of white appliances. About 15 years ago, almost exactly in 2011, their back then CEO, Zhang Rumin, who had been at the company for many, many years, many decades even, made a radical decision. He looked at Haier and said, we're structured like every other large manufacturer, like the best practice. Functional departments, hierarchical decision-making, centralized strategy, and this is making us slow and unresponsive. If we want to achieve other outcomes than our competitors, if we want to not follow in their footsteps, but actually overtake them, we have to radically change. So what did he do? He blew it up, right? Now, almost literally, he broke up the big monolith with back then around 70,000 employees into 4,000 micro enterprises. Small, autonomous units, each one operating as an independent business with its own P&L responsibility. Now, this is radical already, but it gets even more, right? He also thought about all those units that normally don't face customer feedback. Think about HR, learning and development, finance and controlling, right? All of those central IT, all of those units normally don't face end customers. So each month, now what they changed was each micro enterprise must win customers, either external customers in the market or internal customers within Haier. If you're a support function, as the ones we just mentioned, IT services, one example, you don't get automatic funding. You have to convince the other micro enterprises to pay for your services. And if you can't, because you're not good enough, if internal teams would rather buy from an external provider, your micro enterprise gets disbanded. This sounds harsh, but this solves Mises' calculation problem. You remember what we talked earlier about? The missing feedback loops? These units now face real prices, real customers, choices, real consequences. They can calculate rationally because they have market signals. Let me give you a famous example. One of the products that they created ultimately was what they refer to internally as the potato washer. Sounds weird. So years ago, slowly or shortly after they started the transformation, service technicians in rural China kept getting calls about broken washing machines. They found that many of those pipes were clogged with mud. What they realized, talking to those local farmers, so being close to your customer, was that they not only washed their clothes, they also washed the sweet potatoes in those same washing machines. So in most traditional organizations, one VP of product or VP of engineering would issue some kind of memo telling all customers to only use those washing machines for washing their clothes, right? Just to do the laundry, not to put in any potatoes or sweet potatoes. At Hire, because those service technicians were part of their own micro enterprise, they dealt with it differently. They adapted the products. So they built a machine with wider pipes capable of washing both regular laundry and the vegetables. It became a massive hit, right? That is what happens when you remove the middleman, the VP of engineering, the VP of product, and let the engineers, the service technicians work with customers directly. So what Zhang Rumin also changed was how they pay people, right? But that's another mechanism you can also read about as we go. I want to make sure that we also have time for Q&A as we go. So if you look at all those changes that they made within Hire, they ultimately followed a philosophy that I refer to as from nothing comes nothing. Both in terms of if you're an employee that is contributing, right, you participate in the success of the organization. If you're not contributing, you don't. But even more importantly, if we think about organizational change, if you not significantly change the mechanisms within the organization, you won't have any impact either, right? You might have agile theater, but you don't get real agility. Now, this same philosophy is being applied at a completely different company. So we talked about Haier being an appliance manufacturer. Now I moved from China to Germany from 2011 to 2023 and into the pharmaceutical industry with the company Bayer. Bayer is located 30 kilometers away from where I live. I got the opportunity to meet with their current CEO, Bill Anderson, and learn firsthand of what they're doing at that company. So, in terms of size, almost equal to Haier, 100 plus thousand employees, 160 years old, in many different industries, both pharmaceuticals and crop science. Now, Haier proved that you can do those kind of debureaucratization in manufacturing. Bill Anderson is trying to prove it in an industry which is highly regulated, remember, pharma and crop science, by outside regulators, FDA, etc. Now, when he arrived, his initial diagnosis of Bayer was clear. Bayer had become impossibly bureaucratic. Smart people, important mission, they refer to their mission as health for all, hunger for none, but structurally incapable of moving fast. His analysis was exactly what I've been describing. The company had 10 layers of management between frontline workers or teams and the executive committee. 10 layers. They had 1,362 pages of internal rules for people to comply with. An annual planning process locked resources for 12 months, right? And many of you probably work in organizations where the budgeting process works in a similar fashion. Now, Bill understood if we want to be more agile, if we want to move faster, our current mechanisms are preventing it. We have to fundamentally change it. So here are some of the fundamental changes he introduced. First, he flattened the structure dramatically from 10 layers to 2 to 3, right? Which also means that the span of control, right? The number of direct reports every manager had moved from 5 to around 50. They changed even the term. Instead of span of control, they talk about span of coaching, right? And this was not downsizing for cost cutting, right? Obviously, in every transformation, there is at some point some level of cost cutting also. It was not that 15,000 managers were kicked out. Many people that were in managerial positions moved back into teams. So instead of administering, they got back to creating customer value, right? That was number one. Second, he broke the company into thousands of self-managing teams. So they did not create the micro enterprises similar to Hire, but they created what many of us as agilists are familiar with, self-managed teams focused on customers, right? That's where the cross-functionality also plays an important role because otherwise those teams can't deliver end-to-end value. And third, and this is one of those most critical things, and most organizations as part of their agile transformation forget to do it, they went from annual budgeting to 90-day cycles. Now, think about what annual planning does. Every autumn, thousands of managers at a company the size of Bayer spend months negotiating the traditional budgets. They fight for headcount, they sandbag their estimates to create buffers, they lock resources, right, in order to sound very precise for the next 12 months. Now, by January every year, they know that most of those assumptions are already outdated. One of my clients said this about writing thousands of pages of requirements documents. We know those documents are wrong the moment we hit enter. The same is true for annual budgets, especially if they go even beyond 1 year. So Bayer did not go and say, we don't need any budgeting. You can't go to no budgeting as an organization, right? There's a great book, by the way, I mentioned The Enlightened Capitalist earlier, called Beyond Budgeting, written by Bjarte Boxnes. Incredible guy, incredible concept. And many of those elements Bayer introduced within their own organization. So they replaced the entire process with continuous planning in 90-day cycles. Teams focus on what are the 2 to 3 most important outcomes we can achieve towards our mission in the next 90 days. It doesn't mean they forget about the big picture. This is what the mission is for. But they plan similar to what we advocate for in much shorter cycles because that's the range, right? That's the horizon they can see. There are no more annual budget targets, no false precision, no gaming the system. All of that disappears the moment you disbanded the traditional budgeting. Instead, in the traditional system, right, in this system, what they do is now 2 tiers. They still need, for the executive team, for investor relations, for many things, they need some kind of financial modeling. But this is not done by the thousands of managers coming together. This is done by a group of 30 or 40 data scientists that take in all the input, the history of the organizations, the predictions for the market, and so on and so forth, and they come up with a financial model which the executive team can use for strategic decisions. Tier 2 is how those thousands of teams are organized. They are not giving a fixed budget, they're giving a frame, right? What is it that you can achieve and how much is our appetite? Basically, what are we willing to invest in order for you to achieve those things? And every 90 days, they do what we as agilists refer to as inspect and adapt, right? They get the sources, they get the signals, and then they try to constantly modify and assess whether they are on the right track. So keeping time in mind, if we look at these 2 companies, there's much more that I can share with you about them, and I can also give you an abstract that I have written for this talk. If you want to scale through people instead of process, there are three things that need to be developed in organizations. Number one, people require context. They need to understand where the company is heading, not a vague vision statement, actual strategic clarity. Both buyer and hire invested heavily in helping teams understand their mission, their customers, their objectives, right? Because without that context, autonomy is just chaos. We refer to this as enablement first, empowerment second. Part of that enablement is not only providing context, where do we want to go, but also competence, right? People need to be able to make those decisions. This is, by the way, also the primary point of parenting, right? My intention is to develop competence in my three kids. They're today 13, 11, and 9 years old. So by the time they're 18, they don't need me anymore for any decisions. They are competent enough to make those decisions themselves. And this is where we, as agile coaches, trainers, whatever, can come in and support, at least initially, the organization helping their people to develop that competencies. And it's not only process competence in terms of how does agility work, it is also domain competence that needs to be developed in those organizations. But the last one, and this is what I refer to as my framework for decision making, it consists of three Cs, so context, competence. The last one is courage. That is the one that is the most difficult to develop, especially if people have been trained for decades to not be decision makers, but to be decision escalators, right? If you've trained to always escalate any decision that needs to be made, becoming a decision maker yourself is an incredibly hard thing to do, right? But it is necessary. Because as long as people don't take decisions and don't feel courageous enough to take those decisions, the organization won't succeed in becoming faster. Jeff Bezos, in one of the interviews I saw, mentioned that during his time at Amazon, he learned that the primary driver for the organization's ability to deliver fast is to decide faster. This is why at Blue Origin, his new company, shooting like rockets into space, he doesn't want to necessarily build the most customer-friendly organization. That was the mission with Amazon. It's the organization that is the fastest at taking decisions, the fastest at learning. And many of the mechanisms they practiced at Amazon, like disagree and commit, type 1 and type 2 decision making. I won't have the time now to go into more details, right? Those same mechanisms enable them now at Blue Origin to take decisions much faster, deliver much faster, and have much faster market feedback or feedback loops in general so that they can learn much faster. So if we look at the past 100, 150 years, many organizations could survive being bureaucratic organizations because the pace of change in their environment and their competitors' ability to learn was not the same as it is today. If we look at Blue Origin or SpaceX today, if we look at Amazon as a retailer today, if we look at what Bayer will be capable to do in the future based on the transformation they're going through, I think every single organization needs to ask themselves, how much bureaucracy can we or do we still want to afford? Because honestly speaking, debureaucratizing an organization does not mean the organization will die in chaos. If we do it the right way, if we implement the right mechanisms, if we learn from companies like Hire and Bayer, but also Amazon, etc., then we manage to create organizations with a massive scale, but the ability to be as nimble as a startup. And what do all startups have in common? Very little bureaucracy. So with this said, Victor, I hand over back to you, and any questions are welcome. up until the end of the time box or as long as you want to go. Yeah, handing back to you, Victor.
Thank you, Saurabh. Very enlightening and insightful case studies that you've shared. Thank you so much. Yes, anyone, if you have questions for Saurabh, please fire away.
Yeah, so Rob, it's Cameron here. I don't have a question per se, but I found your talk here quite thought-provoking, and yeah, there's lots of good stuff that you've covered there. I found it very interesting. So I just wanted to thank you for your time there. So really appreciate what you've done. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Cameron. That was the intention, right? The intention, there is this great quote from Socrates, I cannot teach you anything, I can only make you think. And that's how I usually approach. I obviously can teach stuff, otherwise I wouldn't be a trainer. But I think there is so much more value in provoking thoughts. And happy that happened in this case. Thank you so much for the feedback, Cameron.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Cameron. Anyone else?
Sometimes we don't have this, or we encounter this excuse or this reason given by people who are not attuned to making decisions that is out of their pay scale. They're not paid to do that decision making. How do we change such thinking?
So, Victor, did you get the question? Because I didn't get it.
Yes. So
Due to the audio. So not that the question is bad, but due to the audio, I didn't get it.
yes, the audio. Sorry, I probably on commute, our folks. So I believe the question, Peter, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the question was, what if people have the perception at the lower ranks or the lower rungs, they have the perception that they are not paid at a commensurate amount to make those decisions? How do we move them away from this sort of thinking and behavior?
Yeah. So basically, the decision being above my pay rank.
Yes.
Yeah. I know that this, I mean, maybe this is because I didn't work in a corporate myself as an employee. I mean, I work with a lot of large corporations, and but I never asked myself this. So even when I was employed at a pretty large management consulting company called Bain and Company, I never asked. So I only went to someone else for a decision if I thought I cannot make that decision due to a lack of competence. And everybody is shaped by the systems they grow up in. So one of the systems is obviously the family you grow up in. And my parents, due to again the lack of resources to some extent, we were immigrants. They gave me a lot of autonomy. They just relied on me making things work. That was one. In hospitals, you always have a lack of resources. So every person is you believe every person has to make the decisions that they can make, and only if they don't know what to do, they get to someone else. But I've seen what Peter describes in many organizations, and again, because I've not been through this probably myself, maybe the answer is not always politically correct. But I think it all starts with how do you look at yourself and your life, and do you want to be in the position where you say, well, I know this is wrong and I know how to fix it, but I'm not going to do it because it's not my job. And one of the companies, and this again is not only the individual, so the individual can make a difference. I earlier gave a talk to a group of HR people, and I told them, never overestimate what you can do, especially if you only look at a short period of time. So don't believe you can, by this, change how your whole organization runs. But also, do not underestimate what you can do, right? Especially in the long run, by just changing how you behave. Completely forget about everybody else. How you behave. If you see there's a problem, address it. If you think it's not okay, right? If you're not allowed to make that decision, still come with a proposal to the person you believe is the decision maker. And by the way, if you get to them with the proposal, also ask them, hey, I made the assumption that I'm not allowed to take that decision. Was my assumption correct? Or could I have taken that decision so that I know with regards to the future? And in most places where I've worked, and I work with many, many senior leaders, what many of them tell me, and again, there's a difference between what they tell you and what they actually do in some cases. We're all aware of that. But what many of them tell me is that I would love my teams, right, or the individuals to be much, much more courageous, right? And I don't know how to make them more courageous, right? I already tell them this is decisions that you can take and they don't take it. So, but the same teams are like, I don't know if I take it and then it's not the right thing and then I might get punished. So I would always encourage people, test the limits a bit, right? Don't do like stupid things, obviously, but be a bit more courageous. I don't think that an employee showing or demonstrating initiative, the result will be, oh, you're out because you demonstrated initiative. It might be you went a bit beyond what we would expect you to do. Okay, good. Next time I do a bit less in that direction. Or can we actually change the expectations also from management? Because I believe I'm capable of doing those things. And then the pay piece, right? Is this above my pay grade? I think that will automatically follow. Because, for example, at Bain, the fundamental belief was if you want a promotion, you need to demonstrate that you can do that work. How do you demonstrate it? By already doing it, right? You, Victor, myself, I used to be a certified Scrum trainer. You are, I think, one, right? At Scrum Alliance, it was always, if you want to be a CST, you have to demonstrate that you are already at that level. How do you demonstrate it? By already running a bunch of trainings. And I think the same is true for demonstrating that decision-making ability within organizations.
Beautifully put, Shara. Thank you. And thanks for the question, Peter. Um, uh, it's probably also indicative of some deep-seated cultural yeah, element, right? Now that the organization has fostered over the years that's led to this sort of behavior at
Oh,
scale.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All of those things are, and so when I look at an organization, right, the same thing, if you look at a human being as a doctor, that human being is not wrong, right? The systems within they operate, they are quote unquote wrong or outdated. It's not only that they not serve that human, they also don't serve the organization any longer. So, with everything that is happening around us, especially now accelerated by I think organizational design, thinking about those mechanisms, is so much more important than it ever was, right? Toyota built its competitive advantage through the Toyota production system, the process they put in place that allowed for thousands of people to become contributors to the continuous improvement. Continuous improvement at Toyota was never something that was bureaucratic, that was centrally governed. It was decentralized by definition. And I think the same becomes even more relevant for organizations. And this time is not only about how do we continuously improve our process or our manufacturing approach to building cars, but also what kind of cars do we build in the first place, right? Are cars even the right product for the target groups that we're addressing? What other things could we serve through the channels we've already established, the customer relationships we have, or what new needs can we address in completely other areas with the technological capabilities? There is so much uncertainty and so much opportunity out there, and the organization that has the ability to learn the fastest, I think, will succeed going forward.
Yes, thanks, Saurabh. We have one more question in the chat. We have, I think, a minute more, if that's all right.
It's all
Uh,
right with me.
yeah, thank you. So I think the question came from Kushik, which is how does a startup scale and not become bureaucratic as different outsiders, stakeholders, funders have more inputs and want control?
Yeah. So if we're talking about startups specifically, I think so. The most important rule for startups is don't try to get bureaucratic in the first place, and that's to partly that question. Now, I will give you a book recommendation and a short answer as well. The book recommendation is from the Netflix founder, Reed Hastings. The book is called No Rules Rules. And he created Netflix after he had founded another company. He sold that company successfully. So, from a return on investment perspective, it was great. But his quote about the company he had built prior to Netflix was, "We basically we made the organization." What was the exact quote? So they dummy proofed the organization so that only dummies wanted to work there. And what did he mean by that? They implemented so many rules and regulations out of fear that people could do wrong things, which then again attracted people that like to work in those kind of an environment. You can imagine someone that is very entrepreneurial does not like to work in an environment where everything is dictated to them, right? So when he then founded Netflix, after that, he said, at all costs, I have to avoid what we did earlier in that previous company. And this no rules rules became his mantra. And together with many others, he wasn't the only person who architected Netflix, but together with many others, he created a company that is very low, very lean when it comes to policies, so that you don't even have to go through big transformations like Bayer has to do now, right? Every time you have the urge of creating a policy, ask yourself, why? Right? Is it something that one person did wrong? And then the right answer might be we have to have that difficult conversation with that one person instead of introducing a policy for everyone. Or would it actually be a policy that will help us as an organization to be even better at serving our customers? If it's the second, introduce it. In most cases, it's the first thing, right? And then those difficult conversations need to be the replacement instead of introducing policies one after the other.
Beautifully put. Thanks, Saurabh. I think that's a very common pattern that we observe, what you've described.
Yeah,
That's where all the rules come about in large organizations.
yeah.
I'm thinking.
One person gets something wrong, right? They spend too much money on a dinner with a client, expense policy. Well, man, instead you could just say, dude, would you spend your own money for that? Right? I don't think so. So please don't do that again, right? And everybody else will also hear, oh, you had that difficult conversation with X. Good, right? You don't need to introduce a policy for everything. So I think there's one more question,
Yes.
Victor. I'm happy to take that one.
Yes. Janina, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. So these kinds of revelations, these improvements, these mindsets always come from the people that are fed up with the old ways, right? But then all of these practices makes the organization, the company in a much better place. But when these people resign or leave the company, then somehow the organization resets back to it to their old ways. So, what are your thoughts in these kinds of situations, and how can we make those beautiful improvements stick to the organization, even though those POCs leave the company?
Yeah, and this is a really, really good question. And so I don't know, for example, in the case of Bayer, what will happen if Bill Anderson leaves at some point. Fortunately, his contract was just extended for, I think, another 4 or 5 years, which gives this whole thing continuity. But if we look, for example, at Haier, who has been on this journey for way longer, what Zhang Rumin managed to do is to create ultimately a leadership culture And by culture, I always mean not just values people hold, but behaviors that people demonstrate on a day-to-day basis, where people are multipliers of the philosophy he initially brought in. If you look at Amazon and the reason they continue to succeed, although Jeff Bezos is out as CEO, replaced by Andy Jassy, it is because both Andy Jassy and the rest of the S team, the senior leadership team at Amazon, are fully aligned in terms of everything that Jeff Bezos used to do with the organization. So, really building your successors early on, making sure that they have that same quote unquote DNA, right? For the lack of better terms, I always go back to medical terms, right? Have that same DNA, and they are willing to like stick to those things going forward. I think that makes it really, really strong and sustainable. But yes, in many large organizations where the average tenure of a CEO is like 3 to 4 years, many, although by the way, many of those changes don't even happen initially, let alone having someone come in as a successor and take it forward. So I think a bit more of that long-term perspective is really, really important. And when you're not at the very top of an organization, you tend to stay at organizations a bit longer. Find people that you can create a movement with, and always try to create something that even works after you're not there anymore. But if you don't do that, fully agree, right? It will probably fall back to what is considered the best practice. Now, my hope is that given we see more and more of these organizations that take the alternative path, the whole thinking about best practices will change. But that usually takes years, if not decades, especially if you look at all of the management stuff that is out there. Most of it is still around how to create bureaucratic structures instead of how to create autonomous or self-organized organizations similar to the ones I shared with you earlier.
Thanks, Saurabh. Thanks, Janina. Um, all right. So, would that answer your question, Janina?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Sohrab.
Great. Right. So we are at the end of the session. Thank you again, Saurabh, for taking your morning to speak and to meet with us. We don't get many international speakers these days, so it's really very much appreciated that you would join us. Thank you. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity for you to meet our user group again, and or whether in person or online, or through
Anytime.
Scrum Gathering, plenty of platforms. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. Everyone, have a nice evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sohrab.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.